Area Metropolitan Planning. Oh, sorry. I'd like to call the September 1st Des Moines Area Metropolitan Planning Organization Transportation Technical Committee meeting to order. And so we'll thank you, Tracy, for sending out the agenda. I'd like to ask for a motion and a second for approval of the agenda, please.
Motion to approve the agenda, Huesman.
Thank you.
Second, Miller Ankeny.
Thank you. All right. And again, for those that maybe are newer or filling in, we are doing the meeting online, so we're not going to ask everyone to unmute and say aye. We'll just ask that everyone opposed, anyone opposed to speak up, and so is there anyone opposed? Hearing none, we'll consider the agenda approved. Thank you. Item 3, again, thank you, Tracy, for sending out the meeting minutes. Looking for a motion and a second to approve the meeting minutes for August 4th.
Motion to approve the meeting minutes, Huesman.
Thank you.
Second, Miller Ankeny.
Thank you. Is there any discussion on the minutes? Okay, it's been motioned and second. Is anyone opposed to this motion? Hearing none, we'll consider the August 4th meeting minutes approved. Thank you. Okay, item 4 is a report and a vote on the federal fiscal year 2024 Iowa Clean Air Attainment Program applications. And I'd like to turn that over. Zach, are you?
Yes, thank you. So just a quick reminder that we had spoken with you last month about the ICAP applications. On the screen before you is the list of applications that were submitted to us for funding in this federal fiscal year. You can see that we had 5 applications that were submitted. As I mentioned, we spoke about these in a little bit more detail last month. This month, they're before you for approval. Once these are approved by the policy committee towards the end of the month, we will submit the resolutions on to the project sponsors so they can get those included in their applications prior to the October 1st deadline. So again, before you for a vote, I'll be happy to take any questions if you have. Otherwise, we're recommending approval of these ICAP applications.
Thank you, Zach. Are there any questions for Zach on these? Okay, can I get I'm looking for a motion and a second for approval, please.
So move. John Dostart, City of Altoona.
Thanks, John.
Second, Rudy Castor-Waukee.
Thank you, Rudy. All right, it's been motion and second. Is there any discussion? Okay, is anyone opposed to the motion? Okay, hearing none, we'll consider that approved. Thank you, Zach.
Thank you.
All right. Next item is a report on the model ordinance regulating bicycles and personal transportation devices. I'd like to see Aspen. Are you available to talk on this?
Yep. Thanks, Steve. So the Central Iowa Bicycle and Pedestrian Roundtable has been around for just over 10 years now, and we are a group that meets monthly, and it's a group of parks and rec professionals, engineers, local policymakers that are interested in improving bicycling and pedestrian transportation options here in the metro area. And when I came on board at the MPO last fall and I asked what's a big project that we want to focus on this year, the idea of a model bicycle ordinance, not only just for bicycles, but also for personal transportation devices, was the top issue that we wanted to focus on. So over the last 8 months, the roundtable has developed a draft of an ordinance, a report, and various supplemental materials with a special help of Mindy Moore at HDR and Jeff Wiggins with the City of Des Moines. And what we hope to accomplish with this is that we wanted to address issues, these historical points of conflict that are not currently addressed in many cities ordinances regarding bicycles. And so this again is just a guide. It is a starting point for cities to use to review and update their current bicycle codes, and then also perhaps incorporate personal transportation devices. And we define personal transportation devices, and we don't use the word micromobility, because often when people Google micromobility, what comes up are bike or scooter share programs, and that's not what we're talking about here. We are talking about personally owned devices that are under 150 pounds, that may be human powered or assisted by some sort of electric motor. So we are talking about electric scooters, e-bikes in this ordinance as well. But again, because it's a model, cities can go through it and find out what works for them. Also with this ordinance, it is consistent with the Code of Iowa, but it offers additional regulations to address these points of conflict between vehicular and non-vehicular road users to clarify some gray areas. And then also it furthers all 4 goals in our long-range transportation plan, Mobilizing Tomorrow. Next slide. So why a model ordinance? Again, an ordinance is something that regulates the rules of the road. It also educates users of the road, and it's something that we can coordinate regionally. And then also, this is a pretty good solution to transportation improvements that does not require construction or funding. And so if we can coordinate as a region better rules and operations of our road system, that's something that we don't need to wait around for construction or get a big lump sum of funding. It just takes some time for us to coordinate with each other. And also, why now? As I mentioned, this has been a long-term bike ped roundtable goal. Also, we are updating this year our region's active transportation plan called Interconnect, which should be completed this upcoming spring. And then also with our upcoming Safe Streets and Roads for All application, we thought what better time to really focus on safety of all road users than now. And also, why are we including bicycles and personal transportation devices in the same ordinance? Well, because in our region, we have a multimodal transportation system. We have vehicles, we have personal automobiles, we have freight, we do have bicyclists, we do have pedestrians, we have transit. So how can we again make it so people opting for whichever mode of travel they choose, that they know where they're supposed to be on the road, and also other drivers know what they're supposed to do to react and respond to these other types of transportation. And then lastly, a lot of jurisdictions in our area are ready to address new or popularized device types. Again, people aren't just riding bicycles anymore. We do have electric scooters. We do have electric bikes. So we want to be prepared to respond to those things. Next slide. Also, the American League of Bicyclists puts out these state report cards every year, every 2 years, and Iowa this year, this is 2022, is number 25 in the nation for a bicycle-friendly state. And our worst area is traffic laws and practices. That is where we have a D. And so this is a way for us to address that pitfall in our system. Because as I quote them here, bicycling is more than a practical, cost-effective solution to many municipal challenges. It's an opportunity to make your community a vibrant destination for residents and visitors, a place where people don't just want to live and work, but thrive. Next slide. So here's what our timeline was. Again, back in November, we discussed let's bring up a model ordinance again, let's address current issues. And then throughout the next 7 months, we drafted it, and we finally ironed something down that we were happy with around May. And then throughout June and July, with additional feedback incorporated from city staff and other professionals in transportation fields, in August, the Bicycle and Pedestrian Roundtable officially approved the draft that you all received in your agenda packet, which is what we are discussing today, and will hopefully put up for a vote in October. Next slide. So the ordinance chapters, again, are by no means exhaustive. These chapters were simply selected because these are areas that the working group felt we could do a little bit better given our city ordinances currently. And so we talk about definitions. Again, what is an e-bike? What is a personal transportation device? Scope of regulations, operations, actions against bicycles, responsible riding, etc. I will note that pedicabs and bike and scooter share programs are not addressed in this ordinance. Again, many cities in our area do address other types of devices, but here we are talking about bicycles as the state defines them, which does include e-bikes. And we are not talking about micromobility. So we're not talking about Bird or Lime scooters or anything like that. Next slide. So the primary changes that we are proposing with this ordinance are these 10 areas, 10 or 11 areas. I am not going to go through all of these because no one wants to hear me talk for that long, but I'm going to highlight 3 of them. Next slide, which is the change lanes to pass, the 3 feet lateral passing distance, and the dead red light allowance. We will have time for questions. And so whether or not you want to follow up with me here or after the meeting, if you have questions about any other of these, please reach out. Next slide. I will just briefly mention some points about the Code of Iowa. A lot of the feedback we received about the model ordinances, well, we don't want to adopt anything in our city that is not already in state code. And here's just kind of my preface with that. Local authorities can create and enforce regulations that are not currently in state code, as long as they're consistent and they are not contrary to current law. Also, a bicycle is not defined as a vehicle in Iowa law, but bicyclists are subject to the same rights and duties as a driver. So as you can see, there's a little bit of a gray area there. We know that bicycles are not the same as vehicles or riders of personal transportation devices. However, they're subject to the same rules of the road, but also the same rights. So things like passing is when we'll get into that a little bit. And I reference this 2012 Attorney General letter, which we can link in the meeting follow-up notes here. But that basically said, no, a bike is not a vehicle, but sometimes it is. And so it's still a little confusing. Another thing I'll point out is drivers are required to pass vehicles to the left at a safe distance and shall not return to the right side of the roadway until safely clear of the overtaken vehicle, or in this case, a bicycle. However, there is a specific provision for bicyclists in Iowa code, which is that drivers cannot steer unreasonably close or toward a bicyclist. However, the Iowa DOT currently instructs drivers in their driver's education manual to completely change lanes when passing a bicycle. So you can see there's some inconsistency there. And also, what constitutes at a safe distance is a little bit of a gray area as well. And then lastly, vehicles must stop at red lights until a signal to proceed is shown. Pedestrians shall not enter the roadway unless they can safely cross without interfering with any vehicular traffic. However, much of uniform vehicle operating code, again, determines that if there is an inoperable light, you treat it as a 4-way stop. Often this is signaled by, flashing red, but that's not always the case, but drivers usually adapt to that sort of condition. So I'm just prefacing with that, so that way if anyone had questions about, well, what does Iowa code say? Of those 3 main points I'm going to focus on in the next couple minutes, here's kind of what state code says about that. Next slide. All right, so change lanes to pass is in chapter 5 of the model ordinance, which is on page 9 of that report. And the provision says the driver of a motor vehicle overtaking a person riding a bicycle, electric scooter, or personal transportation device proceeding in the same direction in the same lane on a roadway or street shall pass to the left of the rider in an adjacent travel lane or on the opposite side of the roadway or street, and shall not again drive to the right side of the roadway until safely clear of the overtaken rider and device. So again, this is if you are in the same travel lane as a bicyclist, not if they're in a bike lane or in a shared use path, but if they are in the same travel lane for you. And I will also note that in an instance where you are not in a passing zone, for instance, the double yellow line, some states have specific provisions where, for instance, if it's a slow moving vehicle or device like a lawnmower, you can cross double yellow to go and pass them. Now, Iowa code doesn't specify that. And so this would mean that if you are in a no pass zone, you must remain behind the cyclist, which is what the law says now. If we're treated as a vehicle traveling in the same lane, you have to remain behind a cyclist until until you are in a zone where you can pass them. And the justification for this pretty plainly is safety. Again, if bicyclists are subject to the same rules and rights as drivers, that's one thing, but we also are all wise enough to understand that even if we follow the same rules on the road, a bicycle is not nearly as massive as a vehicle is. And when you're traveling at higher speeds, especially, you are much more vulnerable riding a bicycle than you are in a vehicle. And so changing lanes to pass gives cyclists enough room that they can remain safe. But they are traveling at a much slower speed. And so, we don't want to congest all of our roads by having people wait behind. So changing lanes to pass is a way to keep them safe. And then also this clarifies what are you supposed to do when you're behind a cyclist in the same travel lane. And so we feel for the enforcement of this rule and for the safety, this is a little bit clearer. Does anyone have any questions on this before I move on to the lateral passing distance? All right, next slide. Lateral passing distance is also in chapter 5 on page 9. And what our model ordinance says is the driver of a motor vehicle overtaking a bicycle, electric scooter, or personal transportation device that is traveling on a paved shoulder or in a bicycle lane shall give at least 3 feet of lateral passing distance between the outside of the vehicle and the rider and device. So that we also intend to mean that the distance between the outside of the vehicle includes your mirror. So from the outside of your mirror to that cyclist, that's where the 3 feet needs to be in. And again, so this is if they are in a bicycle lane, so the same on-street facility, but in a dedicated bicycling facility. And the reason why we choose 3 feet is, again, many states, that's a best practice with them. Iowa does not currently have a lateral passing distance law. But again, our law currently just says at a safe distance, whereas we want to put an actual amount on that. So that way, again, drivers know how much they're supposed to leave, and bicyclists can better predict what a driver is going to do when approaching them from behind. And same as the change lanes to pass, our justification here is safety and clarity. So you as a driver know how to respond to a cyclist, and also you as a cyclist feel safe operating on the same roadway as vehicles. Does anybody have any questions about this one?
Aspen, I do. This is Steve Neighbor. I guess I don't know if this came up in the committee discussions, but if we as cities are installing just conventional bike lanes with no buffer, which are all over our metro. And so in other words, you probably might have a 10, 11, 12-foot travel lane, and then with no buffer and a striped bike lane. I personally don't see cars. If you wanted to get the 3-foot buffer, technically you probably would need to cross over the double yellow to pass the bicyclist, because there's no buffer in the bike lane. I don't see people doing that. So I know, or at least in Des Moines, our goal is to try and get the 3-foot striped buffer, like you might see on East Grand Avenue or on portions of Ingersoll Avenue, but we don't have that everywhere. And so I guess what I'm wondering is, are we setting ourselves up for something that's not realistic because we have conventional bike lanes everywhere? Does that make sense? When we're saying that they have to be 3 feet apart, but we're striping the road such that that's not really encouraging that case, right?
Yeah, so I think this is a perfect example on how the city of Des Moines would again use this as a starting point, but then lead to their discussions of, well, okay, based on our context and our current facilities, here's what we are able and not able to do. So I would say in that case where you can't stripe the 3-foot buffer, so it's already there, or put up balustrades or anything, what you might consider is, okay, maybe this only applies on roadways that are that have on-street facilities that are over 30 miles an hour, for instance, because we know that like 25 miles an hour is kind of the tipping point for whether or not a cyclist in a vehicle accident is going to result in a fatality or not. So it might be something where, okay, we have this lateral passing distance as, a guidance, but if you have to cross over double yellow and you can't safely do so, and you can't maintain that 3 feet, either, sorry, you have to remain behind them until you can, or you might consider, well, we'll only have this on roads where either the annual daily traffic exceeds a certain amount or where the speed limits might be considered. It would be my guidance on that. Again, I wish Mindy or Jeff were here today to help explain, but again, we'll continue to talk about this month and bring it back in October. But that's a good question.
So what you're saying is we could consider starting with this, but amending it to add to the sentence that says when the speed limit's over 30 miles an hour, But again, you could see where the 600,000 people in Des Moines, probably, how many are on this call? Maybe 30 plus maybe another 100 would understand all this, right? If I'm driving on a road and there are striped designated lanes and there's a striped bicycle lane, the normal person is going to say, I'm just going to stay in my lane because we all have our lanes marked, but technically they'd be violating this code in many cases.
Again, so this is just, yes, a starting point. And so the idea here is, again, to help keep cyclists and drivers safe, but then also clarify, well, what am I supposed to do in this situation? And it might be something too, where this just gets people to start to consider of like, well, okay, if I'm traveling in my lane and the cyclist is traveling in their lane, it should be fine. But if you're on a road, I don't know if there's any roads in Des Moines where, speed limits are 45 and there's a bike lane, for instance. That's a pretty unsafe situation, right? So even in the design of our roads, we might, reconsider, well, maybe this helps us think about where we're putting on-street facilities versus having those separated facilities. Because if we put a bike lane on a road, that's 45 plus miles an hour, we're kind of setting up accidents right there, because there's no way that you as a cyclist would feel very comfortable with that traffic next to you, so you wouldn't use it. So this, again, yes, is something that you can modify to fit your context, but it's just getting you to think about how both users of the road, vehicles and non-vehicles, how they share that space without always needing to be separate. So maybe it's, well, let's have, this best practice of a 3-foot passing distance. Or it might be something where we have signage that, like I know, the chair of our roundtable, Vern Willey, he spends a lot of time down in Arizona in the wintertime, and they have a lot of signage up of, hey, maintain 3 feet. And so it might even just be something where, we talk about sort of that educational campaign where it might make sense to stay in your lane. But if City of Des Moines decides, no, we want this lateral passing distance to be universal, it might be something where signage is how you get people to change that thinking too. But yes, just a starting point, just to get people to think about what facilities we're putting on which type of roadway, and then also what reasonably are we able to do to keep all of our road users safe. It is by no means prescriptive.
Thank you.
I'll move on to the next one, which is the dead red light allowance, which is chapter 4, also on page 9. And what we've laid out here is that if a person riding a bicycle, electric scooter, or personal transportation device is stopped pursuant to the directions of a traffic control device and has a reasonable belief that the traffic control device or signal is unresponsive or not detecting their presence, thus rendering the person stranded, the person may proceed through the intersection, provided that A, there is no other vehicle approaching or entering the same intersection from a different roadway, from the same roadway approaching or entering the intersection from the opposite direction. 2, the person proceeds exercising due care through the intersection with consideration for all other applicable rules of the road. And lastly, that one complete cycle of the traffic control device or signal or 90 seconds has passed. So it's not cyclists running a red light. It is, in my thinking, an inoperable light. So again, this would occur where we have inductive loop signals. And I reached out to a lot of the city engineers or public works departments in our metro, which was included in the agenda packet too. Where do you have inductive loops? To kind of make the case that, you know, we have these metro wide. But also a lot of the responses I got were, okay, we have a couple inductive loop signals, but most people seem to be transitioning to radar or video detection, which is very encouraging. However, cyclists, again, not as big as vehicles, and with inductive loops, they don't have the near as much magnetic interference with those as a vehicle does, so they might not trip that signal. And so we would like to propose and encourage cities reconsider that and say, okay, well, if I'm a cyclist and then I'm stranded, I don't want to have to get off the roadway and go push the pedestrian actuator to trip the signal. And also I don't want to wait around for a vehicle to come trip the signal. And so in that case, if there's no other vehicles there, why not treat it as a four-way stop? Because you are not being detected properly. That is the justification here. So again, safety and efficiency, because if you as a cyclist are stuck there until a vehicle shows up, you might be there a while, and also it could create an unsafe situation, you know, if you're just waiting there. And then also, then if cars pile up behind you, they might get impatient. So then when you actually proceed through that intersection, then they're like, okay, do I pass them? What do I do here? So it is not that cyclists can treat red lights as stop signs. It is simply that if they are not being detected by a light, that they will not get fined, so to speak, for going through that. And I will mention on part C here that one complete cycle of the traffic control device or 90 seconds must have passed. We chose 90 seconds because most traffic lights that we have in our metro operate on somewhere between a 45 to like 120 second cycle that have bicycles operating on the roadway as well. So we thought, okay, let's do middle of the road. But again, this is one of those things where you as a city should consider, well, where do we have cyclists operating on the roadway? What is, you know, sort of the average cycle time? One of the questions I received from the TMAC group when I presented this to them earlier this spring was, well, if one complete cycle of the traffic control signal has passed, wouldn't the light have turned green? Which is a good point. However, what we're saying here is that is we're kind of prompting our city engineers to think, well, what is one complete traffic control cycle and what is the timing of that? That is what we're getting at here. Yes, certainly if the lights change, that's your indication to proceed through that intersection or not. But again, in terms of a cyclist, if we can put a regulation or best practice out there for our other road users saying, okay, you know, you need to wait at least this long before you determine whether or not it's inoperable. That's what we mean by that. Questions about this provision?
Aspen, was there any thought of putting the person may proceed at their own discretion or risk in this?
Yeah, so in part B there, that's I think what our original draft said, like, you know, at their own risk, they're proceeding, but then we just said proceeds exercising due care. But again, that is definitely something where we considered putting that in, but then we didn't want to make it sound like, okay, we're we're kind of encouraging cyclists to put themselves at risk here, because we don't see this as a risk if, again, no other vehicles are present and you've waited sufficient time. You're not putting yourself at risk by going through that then, which is why we ultimately ended up not putting that language in this.
Thanks.
All right, I'll go on to the next slide then. So where we are now, again, is we are going to present this draft ordinance to the executive and policy committees this month. And then we are also going to discuss it with the Metro Advisory Council. A couple years ago, when a model bicycle ordinance was discussed through the MPO boards again, this was a comment received by one of the board members that we'd like to get folks in this group to offer feedback as well. So I will be presenting this to them on the 13th of September. And then from then until our October meetings, we'll incorporate that additional feedback and answer questions as we can that we receive. And then we will also share, so then we'll put it up for a vote for the MPO's approval in October. And again, what that is simply saying is that we, as members of the MPO boards, think this is a really great step in improving our transportation system. It is not prescriptive. It is not saying now every community in the metro needs to adopt this. What this is saying is these provisions laid out in this model ordinance are really good topics of discussion that you should have regarding bicycling and using personal transportation devices in your community, period. For instance, I think it was when we received comments from the city of Ankeny, one of the definitions we have in the model bicycle ordinance is we define what a bike lane is. And I don't remember who from the city of Ankeny said this, but they said, we actually don't really have bike lanes, so we probably wouldn't define what a bike lane is in our ordinance. And I said, absolutely fine, that's okay. And the reason why we want to have sort of like a regional support of this is so that way there's some consistency. So if city of Des Moines decides, okay, we love everything, but we don't like the change lanes to pass, and then city of Urbandale says, we love everything, we're gonna have it, like, fine, that's great. What we're doing here is, again, giving you a starting point to review your current ordinances and sort of getting you to think a little bit more about, okay, maybe the current rules and regulations we have in place could be improved, and here is what we are ready and able to improve upon. So that's what our vote in October is going to accomplish. And then after that, regardless of what happens, we will then go ahead and share the model ordinance with local jurisdictions for their consideration, and then also help them develop sort of educational strategies if they adopt the ordinance. So how do we then let drivers and non-drivers know, here's sort of some changes that are coming to the metro. So we understand that just passing an ordinance or discussing an ordinance doesn't really change behaviors. It takes a lot of dedicated follow-up for that. I think I just have one more slide that just asks if there's any additional questions. I'd be happy to take those now, or you can follow up with me after the meeting today.
I noticed that one of the items was adding bicyclists and personal transportation devices to that vehicles, motorists should yield to bicycles and pedestrian transportation devices that are in crosswalks.
Yes.
And which I think it's great. Is there anything about clarifying how the bicyclist or personal transportation device should function in the crosswalk? And I just bring that, I'm not expecting the answer, but I don't know if that was a discussion, for the sake of, well, we're adding that so that the motorist must yield to the bicyclist and personal transportation device, but the pedestrian needs to follow say if there's a traffic control device, such as a signal with pedestrian push buttons and signals, when there's a don't walk, they don't go. And so, but there's been kind of a lot of, I guess, differences in opinions on how the bicyclist and personal transportation devices should function in that scenario. And so I just didn't know if there was any discussion on some clarity on that. Because it just, I guess selfishly, unfortunately I've had to deal with a number of claims instances and litigation matters regarding that over the past handful of years, where there's discrepancy on does the bicyclist really, can they really go when it says don't walk, type things. I don't know if that was a discussion or not.
Right. Yeah, so I would say that that kind of falls into, in this model ordinance, we also suggest that folks allow bicyclists and personal transportation devices to operate on sidewalks unless explicitly permitted not to, which sort of the blanket regulation on that is they're permissible on sidewalks unless it's a business district or some sort of downtown, right? Lots of pedestrian activity. And so in terms of operating in a crosswalk, the idea is vehicles yield to cyclists and pedestrians, and cyclists and personal transportation riders yield to pedestrians. So kind of like a little bit of a hierarchy there. So people on foot have, sort of, they're the most vulnerable in that situation. So everyone should yield to them. Cars should yield to the rest. That's sort of the idea there. And so they would be in a crosswalk if they are traveling on a sidewalk and then come to an intersection, right, and have to stop. That's the only reason they should be in a crosswalk. Otherwise, they should be on the roadway or street or in a dedicated bicycling facility. And so the discussion there was, well, what about, a lot of these electric devices now travel pretty fast, and you're walking down the street and one zooms past you. That's one, really startling, not very safe. I've seen a lot of people crash into each other on those things too. So it's a little bit scary. So we say that you have to be riding in a careful and prudent manner. And then we also, in our definition of personal transportation device in e-bikes, we specify, you cannot be operating over 20 miles an hour. If you're walking at a comfortable pace, 2-3 miles an hour, and someone zooms past you going 15 miles an hour, it's still pretty terrifying. But again, this is another opportunity for a city to determine, are we going to have a speed limit when bicycles or personal transportation devices are operating on sidewalks? And that's something for you to decide. But we do say you need to be operating in a careful and prudent manner. You, as a user of a bicycle or personal transportation device, must yield to pedestrians. They are kind of the ultimate right-of-way ownership there. And then also that you cannot be traveling exceeding 20 miles an hour.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think the one thing we'll have to think about, or ask to think about, is just I guess specifically the pedestrian signals. When it says don't walk, does a bicyclist then need to also not enter the crosswalk? Is kind of what I guess again,
Okay.
that's kind of a gray. That's been kind of a gray area, I guess, that I've seen. And I hadn't seen it resolved in any of the litigation matters, to be honest. So,
Sure.
but I appreciate the explanation on the hierarchy as well with that. But
yeah. So I would say,
oh, sorry, good. Go ahead.
Just to clarify really fast, I would say again, if the cyclist is on the sidewalk and they push the signal, they have to wait for the signal. If they're in the roadway and the signal does not detect them, that's when they can go when it says don't walk. But if they're on the sidewalk, they need to follow the pedestrians. But if they're on the roadway, follow the traffic signals.
Yep.
Would be my sort of guidance for a community. Yep. But I see, yeah, John has a question too.
Yep. Thank you. Good, John. John Davis.
Certainly. The question I have, Aspen, is we've identified through this effort some deficiencies, and I think the League of Bicycles has also identified areas in the Iowa code that could be improved. Could you share, if you can, any efforts that are underway to actually enact some of those improvements or clarifications in state code?
Yes. So the Iowa Bicycle Coalition is the one who the advocacy group that kind of leads that. And so I will put in the chat here a link to their legislative and policy page. And so they have updates there of what's currently being discussed in the legislature, what sort of key dates for bicycling and pedestrian related legislation is up. And they update that fairly regularly. I think the last action this year that regarded bicycles happened in March. And in the agenda packet, I included kind of like an Iowa Code bicycling FAQ, in which I cite, well, this isn't currently an Iowa Code, but here are bills that have been introduced about this. So it's something that the legislature has certainly talked about, but what seems to happen is then either if it's introduced in the House, it's then referred to the Transportation Committee and then no movement happens on it. So then that bill dies. So it's really something that, again, comes up a lot, but no action is taken. And I think that's going to be kind of the biggest struggle with trying to get communities to adopt this, is they're like, well, we don't want to, have anything that's not in Iowa Code. And I said, well, we have a lot of things that are not, currently in Iowa Code that we have in local ordinances. And this, if we as a metro say, hey, these issues are important to us and we're going to try to start adopting these locally, I'm thinking that might, kind of, push the legislature to kind of realize, okay, not only are these, again, known points of conflict between vehicles and non-vehicles, but we have, our localities starting to move on these things because they see there is something that we can do about this. And if we waited for the legislature to do everything, we wouldn't get a lot of things done in our cities. So that link, I think, is where your best resource is of what's currently being discussed in the legislature and what the sort of result is of that. But I'm hopeful that if we as a region start moving on this, that might push them a little bit to say, oh, this is something that, folks see, especially starting in our region, I think would be really powerful.
All right, thank you. And just a quick follow-up along those lines of, are you aware of what other efforts are underway in the similar regional planning MPO entities throughout the state along the lines of this?
Yeah, so the Johnson County MPO, so that's, the Iowa City area, they have been discussing bicycle ordinances this year as well. And when I reached out to them earlier this spring, I was like, hey, are you guys going to do sort of a regional push? And they thought, no way, you'll never get that many people to agree. So they're definitely talking about it. And then the corridor MPO in the Cedar Rapids area, they have a lot of guidance on scooter shares, I know, and other micromobility devices, but it's kind of just in the city of Cedar Rapids. But it's in terms of pushing it regionally, no. And as far as I know, only one other MPO or planning area in our state has a bicycle and pedestrian roundtable, which is Simcoe. Otherwise, it's a city thing where people just look at it citywide. But again, here in our metro area, we have over 600 miles of trails, that cross jurisdictions, which is another reason why regionally having some consistency is really important. And why not here, be the place where we start pushing that in the state.
Okay. Any other questions for Aspen? Okay, hearing none, Aspen, thank you so much for all your work and thank you for all your responses today. A lot of work, and I appreciate the progress in this and improving this, and as well as also the attempt to also kind of put some standard uniformity. As I mentioned, people don't really know the difference between where the city boundary lines are, so it's good to start with this. So this is excellent. So thank you. So
Great, thank you.
okay. All right, next we have a report on the 2019 greenhouse gas emissions inventory update. Allison, are you available to talk on this?
Yes, that's me. I'm going to go ahead and put a link in here just because you can't click on the screen. So just want to give an update. We joined ICLEI in January of this year, have been working with a lot of community partners to get the data back for our emissions reports. This has been a long process. We are asking for 16 cities. And so as of recently, we did finally get back information from Mid-American. So we're moving forward with getting the bulk of the emission data out and processed and things like that. So as of today, in the chat, you'll see a link to our, what I'm calling just a greenhouse gas library for now, that right now has a snapshot of each of the communities' greenhouse gas emissions based on, we have a few outliers still, smaller entities, water is one, aviation, things like that, but the bulk of your emissions are there. Reports will be coming out later. And then later on in these slides, I haven't got them on the website yet, you'll see the transportation data, and those will go up before I leave the office today. So what's coming next after this? So we do have probably about 4 organizations that still do have their data being worked on. One of them is Waterworks, and we're kind of walking slow with that because of the regionalization conversations. Just want to make sure that we get a methodology correct now, that we can move forward as the regionalization continues. But over the next couple of months, I'll be continuing to delve into all of the data and then be preparing full reports. The full reports, again, will be cumulative regional pieces, as well as transportation specific at the MPO level, and then individual community-wide reports that will be going out as well. Next slide, please. All right, so we just wanted to give you a snapshot of what our greenhouse gas emissions look like from transportation. The next item on the agenda is discussing, a potential performance measure for this. So we wanted to give you at least a snapshot going forward from here. So the way we worked with ICLEI and ClearPath, we break it down into 2 categories, gasoline and diesel. And we do make assumptions on how much of heavy trucks are diesel and things like that. But you'll see here, the first slide is going to be your gasoline. So this is all your passenger vehicles, light trucks, and then parts of fleets that would be gasoline. And so you can see the ebb and flow here. Really, it's on the upward trajectory. Obviously, 2020 was an off year, especially for passenger vehicles. 2015, myself, the DOT, and ICLEI went through that data to make sure that it was spot on, and it is. So there's just that drop off of 2015, but mostly overall, we are kind of on the upward trajectory. We do have the data for 2021 on hand, but the emissions factors haven't been set by the EPA and things like that. So the moment those do, we'll add 2021 to this chart as well. Next slide. So this is your diesel. So we continue to see an upward slide here. Obviously, 2020 was not nearly as affected in the diesel. All the trucks were very much still moving, especially with the uprise in, say, Amazon home shopping and things like that. A lot of things being delivered to houses, and so those fleets were moving around a little bit more. Just some things to kind of go over here. So you'll see at the top in the title, it says CO2e. And so this is a accumulation of greenhouse gas emissions. CO2 is one of the biggest ones that we look at. However, methane and other pieces are included in here. And this does run on the metric tons, as you'll see on the left there. Next slide. So when we add it all together, again, 2015 has that blip. It didn't have that in the diesel, but it still, between the two, has that downward slide there. Continuing to look into that, and you'll see 2020 has the dip as well. But overall, without those 2 outliers, we really kind of are on that upward trajectory, and we have tapered off in 2018 and 2019, but we'll continue to look at this. 2020 eventually will be completely noted as an outlier, and we'll have the full data set with 2021, things like that, and we'll bring that back. But I did just want to at least put these in front of you, especially considering our next agenda item. And I'll be preparing reports, and you'll hear from me probably in October or November on the final report and things like that. You can go to the next slide. So through the link in the chat, I have put together each member community's data set, including a pie chart of proportions, the actual bar graph that shows also proportions, but quantities as well. And then just to break that down a little bit, since I haven't quite figured out how to get percentages pop up when you put a cursor over things. I will though, but I did include tables as well, so you could kind of see the breakdown for each city. There are some outliers, and if your city has questions about anything, please feel free to contact me. Some of the things that pop up straight away is Mitchellville has a very high commercial emissions inventory. That's because of the institutional data from the prison. The prison is almost always running full lights and things like that. So Mitchellville is skewed. So in their report, we'll look at, pulling things like that out and looking at community-wide. So each of the community-wide ones will continue to be refined. But we did just want to, since this has been ongoing and we finally do have the bulk of this data, we did want to put it in front of you and make it accessible. And I'd be happy to take any questions people have at this time. And if you don't want to speak now, feel free to reach out to me. But this page will continue to be updated and I will let you know when those updates happen and significant reports are ready to go. With that, that's all I have. If you have any questions, happy to take them at this time.
Thank you, Allison. Any questions for Allison? Okay, hearing none. Thank you so much, Allison. Appreciate that. Next, we have an item report, proposed greenhouse and gas emissions performance measures. Z, are you?
Yep, that'll be me. Good morning, everyone. So last month in July, the US DOT released a notice of proposed rulemaking for a national greenhouse gas performance measure for state DOTs and MPOs. What this proposed greenhouse gas performance measure will measure is declining CO2 carbon dioxide emissions on the interstates and the national highway system roads with a base year of 2021. And so what this proposed performance measure seeks to do is that it hopes to align with national goals of greenhouse gas reductions of 50% by 2030 and also net zero emissions by 2050. As with other national performance measures, MPOs can either support their state DOTs declining targets, or they could also establish our own regional declining targets. As with other national performance measures, MPOs also have no penalties for not meeting the targets that they set or for not making any significant progress towards the performance measure. Next slide. So very brief summary of the performance measure. The performance measure will be a percentage of CO2 carbon dioxide reduction from a reporting year to the 2021 base year. And how the carbon dioxide emission is calculated is that within the state, or the fuel that is consumed or sold will be used, and then we'll multiply a conversion factor to translate from gallons into carbon dioxide emissions. And then we'll also multiply by the proportion of vehicle miles traveled on the interstate and highway system from the rest of the other local roads within the state. The Iowa DOT is currently working with AASHTO in reviewing this proposed performance measure, and the Iowa DOT encourages MPOs like us to also review and comment on this proposed performance measure as well. The public comment period ends on October 13th, and the MPO is taking any comments you might have on this measure. So with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions you have on this measure, and we'll also welcome any discussions or comments you might have.
Thank you, Z. Is there any questions for Z? Okay, hearing none. Thank you so much, Z. All right, next we have a report on upcoming events. Allison, are you able to take this one?
Oh yeah, sure. I'm still here. It is conference season. So we're gonna run through a couple conferences and there's a couple new things. So first, the iStorm conference is coming up. Early Bird has ended many months ago now. September 15th, 16th, right here in the Metro up at the FFA Center. You can go to the next one. Along with that is IceWell. That's the morning session for elected officials and community leaders, really kind of honing in on some of the higher overarching and policy pieces, whereas the rest of iStorm, especially in the afternoon, gets more into the technical aspects of this. Go ahead. So one thing that did just come on our radar in the last couple of days, so there are a lot of these grant programs that are coming out of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and now the Inflation Reduction Act. And so we'll try to keep you as updated on these as possible. But the one that's most pertinent for today, FHWA is holding a carbon reduction program webinar. There's 2 opportunities there. Please do note that they are Eastern time zone, but they're going to be running over what this program is, how to apply, who's applicable, and things like that. If your city is starting to look at something like this, just like we went through the greenhouse gas pieces and the inventories, I can get you data that we have on hand right away if you need it. So next slide. All right, so back to conferences. So we have the Iowa Water Conference, September 28th and 29th. This time it's in Dubuque, beautiful over there. Next. Okay, so one of the things, I'm going to touch on this for just a little bit longer than usual. So last month we asked all tech members and member communities to fill out the survey online to start setting some priorities so we can put together a EV workshop. We've gotten some responses. Not all of your communities have responded. So if you haven't, I can throw the link in the chat again. It was attached as a reminder on your agenda email as well, but please do, because we are going to be starting this workshop on October 4th at 1 p.m. at the MPO office. And we will have a virtual option, but because of the discussions afterwards about kind of how we're going to proceed, we would very much encourage people to come in person at this time. Obviously, taking COVID into consideration, that will be flexible as we kind of get there, but you'll be seeing this on our homepage soon, and we will be getting out a sign up and things like that, so you can have your staff attend. So more to come on that, but at least wanted to put October 4th at 1 p.m. on your schedules. Next. APA Iowa is having their conference in Ottumwa in October. Once the leaves have started changing, you can register online, and it's always a good conference. Next. So growing sustainable communities, we include this one. Yes, it's in Dubuque, but the rain campaign is going to be there this year. So I know that all of our communities around the metro have in some way participated or been affected by the rain campaign. So we wanted to make people aware that this is out there. The agenda is quite diverse, and we'll be there presenting as well. And I think that's it. Let me know if you have any questions.
Thank you, Allison. Any questions for Allison? Okay, hearing none. Let's move on to next item, other non-action items of interest to the committee. Are there any?
Yes, I have one. So the Iowa SUDAS board is considering some proposed changes for mostly complete streets and bicycle and pedestrian facility type designs. And so I'll put a summary, the summary document in the chat here, and then also the full markup if anyone is curious. But the chapters that I have here on the slide are the ones that are being considered. The next District 1 meeting for this is October 19th, and the Bike Ped Roundtable thought it would be a good idea to have, kind of a detailed look at the proposed changes to see if there might be anything that we could further suggest, but also really commend the SUDAS board for considering. And this is coming from, I guess, the Governor's Transportation Council. I don't know if that's the right thing. They brought it up that, hey, a lot of the stuff that we have in SUDAS isn't really up to speed with a lot of the current AASHTO and NACTO guidance. So that's what they're looking at here. And so we are going to work through incorporating like a summary of what our additional feedback would be for this group so that we can present it to them in October at their meeting, or just incorporate it with them. And so we will be reaching out probably to our technical committee here again in October with that summary sheet to see if there's anything you might want to add to it or have us bring to their attention. And then also we will be asking our SERPA board members for feedback on that as well. SUDAS reviews happen every year, but big comprehensive updates like this don't happen very often. So it's very encouraging that this is something that they are taking initiative on. So if you have any questions about that, I'm happy to take them or follow up with me afterwards. But again, the summaries and that full document is in the chat there, and we'll include it in the meeting follow-up email as well.
Thank you so much, Aspen. Any questions for Aspen? Okay, any other non-action items of interest to the committee? Okay, hearing none, our next meeting date will be October 6th, 2022, at the same time at 9:30 in the morning. We'll consider this meeting adjourned. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.